what has happened there. Most of that has Julius Schoeps already told. This hope was often overshadowed. This hope often overshadowed, indeed, a clear view on what really happened in the region. Overwhelming bad news of horror have changed this today. Entire ethnic, religious, and cultural groups that have long-lasting roots in the history of the Middle East are in danger to disappear by expulsion or extermination. And we are faced with an uncontrollable rise of political violence, falling states, growing power of militias, apocalyptic political religious sects with deadly ethno-religious warfare and cleansings. In the end, human rights experience. But are we really aware of the deeper reasons for the tectonic ruptures that happen in the region, of their historic origins, the challenges of the past and how they dominate present memories, the background, the motivations and the aims of the different regional players, the meaning of these turbulences for civil life and global order in a short and long time perspective? In many ways, I believe we are still, to put it in the words of Immanuel Kant, standing in the middle of a fog instead of being able to clearly analyze the fog from outside. And so let us try to understand some steps as much as we can in this conference to change this. Thank you, Will, and thank you. And let's have a good start this evening.
most notably enormous streams of refugees with serious consequences for the country's resources, security, and long-term demographic and political setup. None of these challenges, problems, and conflicts can be attributed in a monocausal way to the Arab Spring or its crisis alone. They are rather part and parcel of a multi-layered conflict configuration that is rooted in the region's history and the region's absorption into larger international power struggles with an increasingly global dimension. Third, the Orient-Institut Beirut is part of the Max Weber Foundation, a legal entity established in 2003 that currently comprises 10 German humanities research institutes abroad. In the background of this hall, a video camera team of the Max Weber Foundation will be present during our conference in order to record selected takes of this event for video streaming on the blog page. It might perhaps be advisable to complement the once fashionable optimistic references towards a great transformation of the Arab world by cautious terms like transition or even in the plural transitions, leaving it open to what state of affairs these transitions might finally lead to. After the media euphoria about the Arab Spring in 2011 and 2012, this may sound a bit sobering, but it shows that the leading question of our conference, namely, where is the Middle East heading, is not only a thought-provoking concern for journalists, but also for academic research in the humanities and the social sciences. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome at the European Academy Berlin. I'm Elisabeth Botsch, Program Director here in the Academy. And it is a very great pleasure to welcome you and to host this international conference. The European Academy has always been a place for international exchange and discussion within the European Union, but also outside with the neighbor states. The Arab Spring has been in the center of our work since 2011. We have developed programs for supporting the transformation, namely in Tunisia, and have programs of good governance and also urban development and local democracy, and namely this program on local democracy and urban development includes the issue of minorities. So let me say again, it's really a great pleasure to have you here. And I want to thank the partners, and I wish you a successful conference and fruitful discussions, and I hope you will feel well here at our academy, and we will do our best to let you have a good stay here at the academy. Thank you very much. I want to stress again that this conference will be recorded, and there will be a possibility to follow the conference at this stream. So thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have the pleasure to introduce our first speaker, SHLOMO AVINERI. SHLOMO AVINERI is Professor of Political Science at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem and member of the Israel Academy of Sciences and Humanities. He served as Director General of Israel's Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the government of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. Professor AVINERI is currently recurring visiting professor at the Central European University in Budapest. In 1996, he received the Israel Prize, the country's highest civilian decoration. Among the books which have been translated into many languages are the social and political thoughts of Karl Marx, Hegel's theory of the modern state, Israel and the Palestinians, the making of modern Zionism, Moses Hess, prophet of communism and Zionism, and the intellectual biography of Theodor Herzl.
Good evening. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for the initiative of holding this quite unusual conference and also for inviting me. I find it very symbolic and meaningful to notice the institutes and organizations which have initiated this conference. The role of the Lepsiushaus in defending minorities in the Middle East has already been mentioned. And I find it very symbolic to have a cooperation between the Moses Mendelssohn Zentrum and the Orient-Institut in Beirut for a very simple reason. One way of looking at what Moses Mendelssohn was trying to do was to try to find a modern way under the umbrella of the Enlightenment for Jewish people and for the Jewish religion to find its place in a modern and modernized Europe. An attempt which was noble, not always successful. And obviously Lebanon, as we have already heard, is an attempt to maintain elements of pluralism and tolerance in a very difficult situation, again, with sometimes problematic outcome. I'm coming from Jerusalem, El-Quds, which has always been a city of minorities, but always a city of fight for domination and hegemony. From the very time when, after the destruction of the Jewish temple, Emperor Hadrian changed its name to Aelia Capitolina to suggest its Roman, pagan, and not Jewish identity. It has always been a city of minorities, and one of the paradoxes, and I'm going to discuss a lot of paradoxes in a few moments, one of the paradoxes of the composition of Jerusalem is that in the middle of the 19th century, even after 300 years of Ottoman rules, the largest minority in Jerusalem, as pointed out by Karl Marx for very strange reasons, has been the Jewish minority in Jerusalem before the beginning of Zionism. So you have here paradoxes upon paradoxes upon paradoxes. Now let me start by, as I said, by pointing out to one paradox, which in a way was already mentioned with regard to Lebanon. When we use the term minority, we are using an intellectual construct which is very modern. Minorities as groups have a meaning only if you have a majoritarian democratic philosophy of politics. You are a minority only if there is an idea that majorities have legitimacy as such. And therefore, we never find the term minorities until the beginning and the middle of the 19th century. People were speaking about communities, about groups, about churches, about peoples in a non-modern sense. But the term of minority denotes that there is a legitimacy for majority rule, which puts minority in an ambivalent position. And one, as Professor Schoeps has already mentioned in his opening sentence, one of the ideas of modern democracy is that it is not only majoritarian, but it is also committed to minority or minorities' rights. And the clash between majoritarian democracy and minority rights is one of the issues which also came up, especially in the case of Egypt, after the beginning of the Arab Spring and the first democratic elections, which were held in Egypt, and gave an outcome which was, to say at least, problematic, if not paradoxical. The other paradox has to do with the legacy of the Ottoman Empire. On one hand, the Ottoman Empire is, especially during World War, because of what happened in World War I, is etched in universal memory with the terrible tragedy, the Armenian genocide. But on the other hand, the Ottoman Empire, which was a brutal autocracy, was on the other side also an example of the possibilities of some tolerance, what we would today call minorities. And this is obviously the millet system, which allowed non-Muslim communities, I'm not going to use minorities because nobody talked about minorities under the Ottoman Empire at that time, community to maintain some cultural autonomy with a lot of coercive power through the jurisdiction which was given to various religious courts, canonical courts, the Chacham Bashi, the Jewish chief rabbi, and in a situation which was basically very hierarchical and very authoritarian, there were elements of pluralism. And the other paradox that I want to mention is that the state system, as we know it today in the Middle East, and we see it being under extreme pressure, has not been an outcome of autochthonous social political movements, but was imposed from the outside. And I'll come to it back in a moment. The fourth paradox has to do with the fact that the dominant ideology, which has very much determined the history of the Middle East in the last 100 years, mainly that of Arab nationalism, started as a minority phenomenon among Christians, Arabs. And it was developed by people, Boutros Boustany perhaps the most significant among them, Greek Orthodox by background, who were trying to find an alternative identity to being dhimmi in an Ottoman Muslim caliphate by trying to find out the common cultural links that were linking all Arabic-speaking people, whether Muslims and Christians. So the paradox is that when you look at the history of the emergence of Arab nationalism in the Middle East, and Beirut was obviously a key place to it, it has to do with the impact of the American University in Beirut, or the Presbyterian College that it was then called, and the inspiration given mainly to local Christian Arabic-speaking people by Western missionaries who were trying to make it easier for Christians who are Arabic-speaking to find their place in an Ottoman Empire which was changing itself. Which led also to the fact that the first violent military expression of Arab nationalism was during World War I, aimed with British imperial help against the Turkish Empire, against the Sultan who was also the Caliph. So you had, in the name of Arab nationalism, Arab Muslims fighting as allies of British imperialists against a Muslim Ottoman Caliph. Now, all those issues are sometimes forgotten today because we are very much impacted by the daily news, and some of it is pretty terrible. But we have to realize that what we see today is perhaps a late outcome of post-imperial developments. When empires collide, when empires collapse, be it in Central and Eastern Europe or in the Middle East, the post-imperial structures which are set up immediately and appear to be very stable and are aimed at stabilizing a very non-stable situation, those structures may last 40 years or 50 years or a century, but when put under pressure, they appear to be extremely fragile and extremely unstable. I don't want to discuss Central Eastern Europe, but it is something which is now, of course, at the concern of many people in Europe, but not only in Europe. The current Russian-Ukrainian war, and there is no other way to call it, is an outcome of post-imperial developments. The Soviet Empire, which was on one hand the inheriting a Tsarist empire, but also a communist Weltanschauung, which also was imperial, collapsed almost overnight. And we were always, I have to say it in Berlin, we were always fascinated by the fact that so little violence, practically no violence, Yugoslavia apart, Chechnya apart. But basically, who would imagine that the Soviet Empire will collapse with no violence, not through an Armageddon or World War III? But when you look more carefully, you see that when the Soviet Union collapsed, one Soviet Union disintegrated into 15 states, which were on one hand nation states, but their very identity and their borders were the outcome of communist bureaucratic decisions, including the borders. The question of the borders of present-day Ukraine have to do with the fact that Ukraine in its present recognized borders includes areas which were annexed to the Soviet Union, mainly due to Ribbentrop-Molotov and then the Soviet victory in World War II, and a decision made by Soviet bureaucrats for all kinds of complicated reasons to include Russian-speaking areas in the East in order to dilute Ukrainian nationalism, and then this very strange history of Crimea, which I don't want to repeat because everybody knows how strange it was that Crimea, which was never part of Ukraine and had always an ethnic Russian majority, became part of Ukraine due to a decision of Nikita Khrushchev. And all of a sudden it becomes clear that the borders, which looked for 20, 25 years as being more stable and a guarantee for stability, are very fragile, and the story is not yet finished. And the same, in a much more deeper way perhaps, happened in the Middle East. Because those of us who are young enough to remember the borders of the Middle East, the borders of the Middle East on which we grew, which are in many cases straight lines in the sand, the border between Syria and Iraq, the border between Iraq and Saudi Arabia, the border between Iraq and Jordan or Transjordan as it then was, are an outcome of, and this was already mentioned, of imperial decisions of how to divide the spoils of the Ottoman Empire. The names are perhaps more symbolic than substantive. Sykes-Picot, a British diplomat and a French diplomat, decided to divide the Levant, the post-Ottoman space, according to the interest of France and Britain. The borders of Sykes-Picot, which were drawn in during World War I, were then changed by International Conference, San Remo, Lausanne. But basically, here you had a new order, as it was already mentioned, imposed on the Middle East by Western imperial powers as an outcome of the war without any relevance to the realities on the ground. When you look at the borders as they were stabilized, and therefore they were sometimes so straight lines, they did not take into account neither history, nor geography, nor demography, no religious and ethnic identities, not the history of those countries, and certainly they never asked the people there whether they would like to be Iraqis or Syrians or Lebanese or Jordanians. Of course, the Palestine issue was much more complicated by the Zionist-Arab conflict, but basically people were never asked. And in many cases, the imperial powers ruled those initial mandates, which later became independent states, by using, and I'm not using it in a cynical way, a dividend in imperial system, but basing their power in countries like Iraq and Syria on minorities. In the case of Iraq, which never existed as a state like this in history, there were empires, Assyrian, Babylonian, and Abbasid Caliphate, but never a state like Iraq. Under the British, the Sunni minority was given power over a Shia majority. In Syria, the situation was more complicated, but it is not an accident that there is now an Alawite hegemony in Syria, because under the French, it was the interest of the French colonial power to rely on Alawites and Druze in the Syrian French army in order to maintain control over a Sunni majority. It's the exact opposite, of course, of the situation in Iraq. So we had here a situation in which countries were set up under the umbrella of being nation states, and we thought, or many of us thought until very recently, that we have in the Middle East, mutatis mutandis, something like a Westphalian state system. A Westphalian state system with a Weberian definition of the legitimate use of power, monopoly of power. And it was in the interest for many years of the rulers in those countries, many authoritarian rulers of different ways, to maintain the status quo and not open a Pandora box, because everybody understood that once you start messing around with the Sykes-Picot or post-Sykes-Picot arrangement, you open a Pandora box. And first the American invasion of Iraq, but later the popular forces that were brought up by the Arab Spring made this system very fragile, and the system is now unraveling. If I want to make a general statement about what we see today in the Middle East, and not only in the Levant, not only in Sham, but in the greater Middle East, we see that the state system is unraveling. The Arab Spring has not been very successful for reasons which perhaps we will discuss later in maintaining a consolidated development towards democracy and pluralism. But the Arab Spring has challenged the state system in the Middle East, just as the fall of communism has challenged the state system in the Soviet Union. There is no Soviet Union anymore. And what we see is when we look at country after country, with one exception, that we see trans-border, transnational developments. And when we ask, as a conference is asking, where is the Middle East leading or moving, I don't know where it is moving, but I know from what it is moving away. It is moving away from the false Westphalian nation-state system, which viewed all those countries as nation states, more or less under the umbrella, with the exception of Lebanon, of course, and Israel is a separate story, with the as Westphalian nation state. Iraq, and here it is not the Arab Spring, but the American invasion. The American invasion not only brought down Saddam Hussein and a very authoritarian regime, in a very bloody authoritarian regime, but also put an end, and one has to admit it openly, to the existence of Iraq as a unified Arab nation state. Even in the official constitution of Iraq, it is not an Arab nation state, it is Arabic and Kurdish. And what we see in Iraq today is, on one hand, the emergence of a Kurdish de facto state. It can be called an autonomy. It's being called a de facto autonomy, but it is a de facto state. The Kurdish regional government behaves like a state, and I think to a very large degree passes the Weberian criterion of the legitimate monopoly of the use of power. The Kurdish regional government has its own army. It has faced some problems recently, but it has its own army. The army of Baghdad has no footing and no presence in the Kurdish region. It has its own administration. It has its own economy. It appears to be something like a state without calling itself a state. There are de facto embassies in Erbil. Erbil, they're not called embassies, they're called consulates. There are Kurdish embassies in many Western countries. They're not called embassies, they're called delegation of the KRG. But they are, for all practical purposes, embassies. The education system in the Kurdish region is now in Kurdish, and there is now a whole generation of young Kurdish people who do not speak Arabic at all, because they go to Kurdish language schools. Now, will this lead to an independent Kurdish state in this area? Will it spill over into other areas? And Kobani is an example of the other area. And there is a Turkish context in it, which complicates it. I do not know. But I cannot see again Iraq being the sort of Arab nation state that it was under Saddam Hussein and under all his predecessors. And the Sunni-Shia divide in Iraq is, of course, deepening. Syria. A few years ago, people were prophesying that Assad will fall within a few weeks and days. And this was obviously Western democratic liberal wishful thinking, because people thought that a dictator like Assad has to go. Assad maintains his power today, but not over all of Syria. Syria has been balkanized, so to say. And it is, again, regardless of what's happening in Kobani and other Kurdish areas in the north, you see a situation where it is very difficult to imagine Syria emerging as a coherent body politic, dictatorial or democratic or anything in between. We see that some of the Syrian situation, as in the past, but now also with a lot of violence, is spilling over into Lebanon, especially in the north of Lebanon, in the Sunni areas of Tripoli, where there is an Alawite minority. But it's not only the Levant. Sudan, which was set up by the British imperialists after they managed to win the war against the Mahdi, again an Islamic revivalist movement, which one day has to be seen in the context of what's happening today. Sudan is not anymore the one Arab Islamic hegemonic country. South Sudan is independent with a lot of internal problems. The issue of Darfur is yet still open. There are now negotiations between the Sudanese government and Darfur. And again, very difficult to say where Sudan is heading, but certainly it's not going to be the one unified country ruled by Khartoum. Libya. One has to understand the difficulties in post-Gaddafi Libya has to do with the fact that Libya as a political entity never existed historically before the Italians occupied two provinces, Tripolitania and Cyrenaica, of the Ottoman Empire, and called it Libya, which is a good Latin name. It's not a historical name, and made it into one entity. Once the iron fist, very unique iron fist, of Gaddafi disappeared, it appears that the two areas Tripolitania and Cyrenaica, cannot find a common language of creating a minimal political structure. You have two parliaments, you have two governments, and you have numerous militias or armed groups or whatever you want to call them. When you look even at the history of those two areas, Cyrenaica in the east, always closer to Egypt, was viewed as part of the Mashrek, the Levant, and the West, of course, part of the Maghreb. So it is a very unstable situation, and to imagine today that those countries can be put together into a coherent Westphalian state system is a serious challenge, and I cannot see how it is happening, especially when you have now a phenomenon like ISIS, Daesh, Dawla Islamiyya, fil Iraq, Isham. Isham is not Levant, Isham is not Syria. This is Isham. This is an historical entity in the Arab and Muslim consciousness, if you wish, Greater Syria, more or less. You have now a group which is not only violent and murderous, but it is openly challenging the existence of Iraq and Syria as independent identities and entities. And the border between Iraq and Syria in this area is not existing anymore. I do not think that ISIS is going to win. It's going to be weakened in one way or another. But the challenge is there. And it is a serious challenge that goes very deeply into historical consciousness, because it turns out that ideas like a caliphate, the idea of a Sham as an entity, once the Pandora box has been opened, are appealing to a lot of people in the region. The focus now is, of course, on volunteers coming from the West, but it is appealing to a lot of people in the area. To this, I want to add another paradox, which makes the issues in the post-Ottoman, before that, one caveat. Egypt is different. Egypt is an historical entity that goes back perhaps 5,000 years, with structures and with histories which are deeply rooted in the consciousness and institutions of the Egyptian state. And in the case of Egypt, the Coptic group, again, you never should call it a minority in Egyptian political language. The Coptic community is as Egyptian as the Muslim majority, and perhaps more Egyptian given its history and its provenance. So Egypt is very different, and nobody challenges the identity and entity and borders of Egypt. And one should bear this in mind, and it gives Egypt, even under the present military government, an advantage which other Arab countries which are disintegrating do not have. But to the fifth paradox that I want to mention, and it has to do with the idea of secularism. In the Western political tradition, which the West usually and not very successfully tries to impose, or through which to interpret the Middle East, secularism is linked with the ideas of the Enlightenment, with liberalism, with democracy, with pluralism. In the Middle East, the history is very different. There have been very powerful political movements towards secularism and secularization in the Middle East. But they were not democratic, they were not liberal, they were always identified with authoritarian regimes. The Shah and this is not just in the Arab Middle East, this is in the Middle East, the greater Middle East. The Shah in Iran, Atatürk in Turkey, in a milder way, Ben Ali in Tunisia, Mubarak and his predecessors in Egypt, and Assad in Syria. All those dictators are secular dictators who are trying to base the identity of their rule, or have tried, on imposed models of Western secularization. An attempt to separate state and religion, which is relatively easy in the West, precisely because church and state have been, from the Middle Ages, if you wish, from the conflict of the investiture, distinct identities. There's a papacy and there's a church, and there is a state and the king and an emperor. You could institutionally and theoretically make the distinction. Much more complicated in the Muslim Middle East, also complicated in the Israeli case, but that's again a different story. So what you had in Iran and in Turkey and in Tunisia and in Egypt and in Syria was secularization imposed strongly and militantly from above on basically very conventional and conservative populations. And one has to bear this in mind if one wants to understand the Islamic Republic of Iran, or the AK party in Turkey, or the victory of the Muslim Brotherhood in open elections in Egypt. That once this imposed authoritarian secularism disappears, you have a challenge. If you wish, the return of the repressed, the large masses of people who did not live in northern Tehran, who did not live in cosmopolitan Istanbul, who did not live in one or two areas of Alexandria or Cairo, but the large masses, when they were challenging the authoritarian regime, the alternative which they saw was not necessarily Western democracy. The West was identified in most cases with the authoritarian regime. The Shah was identified with the West. Atatürk was identified in the West. Mubarak was identified in the West. And the idea is that everything that comes from the West is not only repressive, but also anti-Islamic. And this gives the Islamic groups in a very different way in Shia Iran and basically Sunni Turkey and of course in Egypt, a very powerful support. Which leads me to the sixth paradox, which is very painful to many people, and especially people in Europe, that it is the Christian groups in the Middle East that find themselves nilly-willy supporting authoritarian regimes. In the case of Syria, it is a fact that most Christians in Syria support Assad, not because they love the Alawite hegemony, but and they know they're not going to have, because they didn't have political freedom under this sort of dictatorship, but they know that under the Assad family dictatorship, as a religious group, they were allowed to maintain their identity and more or less their way of life. And in the case of Egypt, it's the same. When General Sisi announced his coup d'etat, and I mean, the American president may have difficulties calling it a coup d'etat, but it was a coup d'etat, it was a putsch, obviously. If you looked very carefully, one of the 5 people sitting next to him was the Coptic Pope. Because for the Coptic community, 15% probably of the Egyptian population, a very large population, the Muslim Brotherhood democratically elected government was a threat to their life and to their lifestyle and to their religious traditions. It is not exactly an accident that both in Iraq under Saddam Hussein and in Syria today, the foreign minister in Iraq, Tariq Aziz, and the current foreign minister in Syria, Mualem, are Christians. This is not only because they speak English and they have perhaps a better rapport with the West. It is because they represent the will of an oppressed minority that has to make a terrible choice. But when it has to make that choice, they may decide, not exactly democratically, but through the leadership and through the historical experience, that a secular dictator is perhaps better than a democratically elected Muslim majoritarian rule. Those are dilemmas which are very different from dilemmas which are post-Enlightenment dilemmas in the West. And the inability to realize those dilemmas has perhaps in many cases, not perhaps, but has in many cases created not only misunderstanding and policies which were totally out of touch with the reality of the Middle East. Where does the Middle East go? As I said, I do not know. A former Israeli foreign minister, Abba Eban, once said that it's very difficult to prophesy, especially about the future. So I'm not going to prophesize about the future. But perhaps we have to realize that 1 century of adopting in a coercive way Western Westphalian models in the Middle East has come to an end. And we need some creative thinking about alternatives, where simplistic, well, not simplistic, but simple and neat divisions between state and religion, which also had hundreds of years of religious wars in Europe, but eventually were more or less consolidated in the West, are still problematic in the Middle East. And that the Westphalian state system, which was brought to the Middle East by British and French imperialists for their own reasons, and perhaps also for a belief in liberal Westphalian nation states, has to be rethought. A Lebanese philosopher, Habib Malik, has talked about possible ideas of confederalism, federalism. I call it, perhaps in a name which is not kosher, neo-millet thinking. Neo-millet. Lebanon is a very tenuous example, and again, the example is clear. Lebanon is a small country and it is surrounded by not very friendly countries. But perhaps one has to think about states on a number of levels, where there is not only the Westphalian Max Weberian idea that there is one hierarchical system of state structures, perhaps from below, but still hierarchical, and one has to look for pluralism and ambiguities. Lebanon is full of ambiguities. In a different way, Israel is full of ambiguities. We're not discussing Israel here, but there is an Israeli member of the Knesset, an Arab Israeli, extremely anti-Zionist, extremely critical of not Israeli government, but Israeli policies, who once said made a very powerful statement, that the Jews in Israel are a majority, but they behave like a persecuted minority. And the Arabs in Israel are a minority, but they still think that they are a hegemonic majority. Now, this is very polemical and made a lot of Israeli Jews and Israeli Arabs not very comfortable, but it suggests that the simplistic minority-majority way, which is based on the Westphalian model and on the democratic majoritarian system of legitimacy, has to be rethought. I don't know how to do it. And like many other things, and we have to admit it, the Western state system did not just come out of the books of John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau and John Stuart Mill. It is an outcome of centuries of bloody wars, from the 30 Years' War to the Napoleonic Wars to 1848 to World War I to World War II. So if you feel, as one should be, triumphalist about the victory of democracy in the West, this was a victory not through consensus, but through a long series of wars. The dialectics of development are much more complicated. It's not that John Stuart Mill or John Locke or anybody came up with a book and everything was according to the book or according to the Declaration of Human Rights, the Declaration of Men and Citizens of the French Revolution. Much more complicated. Sometimes you needed a Napoleon. Sometimes you needed historically, and I'm not advocating it. Even Fichte spoke about Zwingherr zu Deutschtum, to Deutschheit. Zwingherr. Not easy. The development in the Middle East in the next few years and decades will be complicated. It will be, unfortunately, bloody. It is already bloody. And the only hope is that out of that vortex of violence, there will be wisdom, there will be tolerance, and I'm saying it as a Middle Easterner to Europeans, Europeans should be very humble in trying to suggest to the local people how to run their own affairs. We don't need another Sykes-Picot. even a better one. It's something that has to be left to the local people. It's not going to be solved by bombings. It's not going to be solved by sermons about tolerance. People have to go through it, and sometimes the birth pangs are very difficult and bloody. I'm not advocating it. I'm trying to be realistic what to expect. And one has to listen to the voices. And the voices are coming from the groundswell of what's happening in the Middle East. And I hope that eventually what will emerge in the Middle East is not necessarily something that will be identical or similar to what is in the West. Perhaps when we talk about a neo-millet system, it will be based on a lot of internal tensions and internal contradictions and things that would make people in the West think that it doesn't make sense. If it will make sense to the local people, and the local people can live by it peacefully and with some degree of tolerance and understanding on the others, of the other, it will be a great achievement. But it will come ex Oriente, not ex Occidente. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We are in the middle of the discussion, I think. I think first of all, what time will be dinner?
No.
Okay. 8. So, we have 45 minutes, perfect. First, please.
Thank you very much for your lecture. I'm a historian of the Middle East. And I disagree with a few things that you said, but with the overall picture, I think we could discuss. There's also an Ottomanist in the audience, and I think that, you know, to call the Ottoman Empire an Ottoman Islamic Caliphate, that's usually we don't do that in Middle East history, because there were so many secular tendencies in the Ottoman Empire, in the structure and legitimation of rule and power, so that it's definitely, you know, it was not a caliphate. Maybe Sultan Abdul Hamid was dreaming of one, but that's a different story. But, you know, that aside, I wanted to sort of go back to the end of your lecture and call you up on what you said, that you are a Middle Easterner. And I would say, yes, that you are a Middle Easterner. And I, you know, was very much looking forward to your talk, because I thought, here we have somebody from Israel, and Israel is part of the Middle East. At least this is how we sort of do Middle East history. It's part of the Middle East. And I wanted to sort of, you know, bring out a few points and then ask you sort of, you know, also when in your picture that you gave us, where Israel is figuring. I think that would be really a very, very important and interesting question. I mean, if we talk about minorities, then there's a lot to say. But before that, I sort of wanted to make another point. The dismantling of the state system, we see it before our eyes. But to say that the states were only, or that sort of the movements that made the governments in these independent states were only imposed from the West, I think here we have to be careful. The borders were imposed by the West, Sykes-Picot, and what we are seeing crumbling now might, you know, lead us back to what the Arab dream was after the First World War, namely a kingdom, Faisal's kingdom, and we are talking about roughly the same boundaries now that we see, you know, unravel as a new kind of kingdom that we actually don't want to see, of course, the Daesh emirate, or caliphate in this case. I'm fully with you on this one. So the borders were imposed by the West, but then movements, you know, like the Baath, there were so many indigenous people Sati al-Husri was reading Fichte, not because he was paid by the Germans or forced by the French, but because he wanted to read him, because he thought that there was something that, you know, related to his situation. So we have to be careful. We cannot say on the one hand, we don't want to impose solutions, as you said in the beginning, and I think you're right. But everything that has happened in the Middle East was imposed by the West. That definitely is not the case, I think. And so we should maybe differentiate a bit. So this one point, but I really would also be very grateful if you, I mean, now that you are here, if you could sort of put Israel in the map on this new Middle East. It's a really important question.
I think we collect now 3 voices. Please, Professor Jan.
I listened with a lot of respect and fascination to your lecture, Professor SHLOMO. And you described the situation of the Middle East and the Arabs in particular. Of course, you touched on the Turks and the Kurds slightly, but the description is very good. But I would like to provide probably some reason why the description is correct. The Western society is a simple society, especially after you referred several times to Westphalia. After the 100 Years' War, which ended in the 30 Years' War and the Peace of Westphalia, the Europe was divided into a simple societies with Spain, with one language, one manufactured history, one sect, Catholic. The same with France. When they found a few Huguenots, Protestants, they went around and murdered them, killed them. In Germany, where there was a balance between Catholics and Protestants, they divided the country with basically the South Catholic and the North. In Belgium, where there was 2 different communities, and I like the word communities, it's by the way, Millah. Okay. Nizam al-Millah, that's the system of the Millah. And of course, where the Walloons and the Flavids, they took different places, etc. So European society is the simpler society. Our society is complex even before Islam. Okay, this kind of a communal al-Millah, Nizam al-Millah, that where you have when Muhammad al-Fatih entered Constantinople, there was one Millah, Millatul Islam, in 1517. In 1917, 400 years later, there were 18, as you pointed out. Today, in Lebanon, there is 18 millahs. In Jordan, there is 18 millahs. In Palestine, Israel, there is 18 millahs, as you very well know. And in Iraq, probably more than 18 millahs. This communal system, it survived and because of the Quran itself. In the Quran itself, when the people of the book were accepted, it allowed for the existence of different communities. The second point I like to make in explaining it is that, when you talk about Western culture, it's a rational culture. Okay, in our society, it's a man-centered rather than God-centered. In our society, this includes Israel, by the way, it's God-centered. Okay, because Israel is also, and on this particular issue, shares with the Middle East the idea that it's a God-centered rather than a man-centered society, with the difference that the Israelis somehow were able to combine a certain amount of rationalism with the religiosity or the reasons for the existence. So I think, and the third point I like to make, in an imperial system, which lasted well into the 20th century, in an imperial system, the state is far. It's very, very far away. But geographically, it's far, and by mental connection, it is very, very far away from the different millahs. It allowed, as you described, for a certain decision maker on the local level within the state did not interfere. The state did not build hospitals, did not build roads, did not build schools, did not interfere completely. This kind of a system allowed for this until the 20th century. So when Sykes and Picot and Balfour, okay, because the three of them. And before that, Napoleon. When they decided to draw a new map of the Middle East, they never thought of this kind of heritage, this kind of a political social heritage that is the lot of the Arabs or the lot of the Middle East, because this is the last point I like to make is, you know, in our societies, the political legacy is that of the shepherd. We don't, you know, the idea of equality is a new idea. There is no equality between a Jew and a Christian or a Muslim in the Middle East. You know that. But or between a Sunni and a Shia, and you know that. There's no equality. When the modern state system, which was created along Western lines by the French and the British after the First World War, they introduced the idea of equality. How can a Durzi be equal to a Sunni? How can a Jew be equal to a Christian, or a Christian be equal to a Muslim? This doesn't mean that there was discrimination. It meant simply that the Jew knew where his place is, the Christian knew where his place is, the Druzi knew where his place is, the Shabak knew where his place is, the Kurdi, etc. The different millas, of whether based on religion or based on nationality, knew exactly where they are in the social system. When the modern state of Jordan, okay, my country, or Lebanon, introduced, or Syria, introduced to the religion of the state is Islam. This created a problem. What happened to the Durzi in this case? And when they introduced the concept of equality, how can equality be that kind of a confusion? The modern state could never reconcile itself to could not find the solutions for it. What I'm trying to say, I agree with your description, but I think we should, for our European who thinks in rational terms, I mean, they have their own logic. The Jew have, and the Semitic mind, as you know, have a different logic. And I say that respectfully. You are a Semite and I am a Semite. We don't operate on the logic of the Germans or the logic of the French and the British. We have our own logic, and that is, I don't want to say anymore, but that's enough for that.
It's your question, or will you answer now?
One more.
One more question. Okay.
Ja, ich möchte gerne sprechen. Ich war sehr beeindruckt von Ihrem Vortrag und möchte aber noch etwas ergänzen und fragen, wie Sie das einschätzen. Und zwar sind die Staaten ja nun wirklich nicht Staaten gewesen, sondern, oder mit einem Staatsvolk, sondern eine Schicht, die sich bereichert hat, und zwar maßlos bereichert hat, und eine ganz, ganz große Menge an Menschen, die wirklich sehr arm waren oder sind. Dazu kommt also einmal die wirtschaftliche Schwäche der arabischen Staaten, generell im Vergleich zu anderen Regionen der Welt, und ein ungeheures Bevölkerungswachstum. Ein Bevölkerungswachstum, das im Grunde zur weiteren Verarmung der Staaten führen muss. Wenn man bedenkt, dass in Ägypten mehr als die Hälfte der Bevölkerung unter 25 Jahren ist, dann ist auch bei Bevölkerungsbegrenzung eine Explosion zu erwarten. Wie schätzen Sie den Einfluss dieses Ungleichgewichtes zwischen Arm und Reich und zwischen einer ganz, ganz stark sich verjüngenden Gesellschaft ein, also diesem Generationenungleichgewicht? Wie schätzen Sie da die Auswirkungen auf die allgemeine Entwicklung ein?
Sure.
Can I just build one sentence?
Okay.
Because it's very important. The political tradition is about Ra'i wa Ra'iyya. Ra'i is the shepherd. The shepherd doesn't bother to ask his sheep when he cuts the wool off and puts it on himself. Or he doesn't bother, he kills their children in front of them and he eats them. And he kills the sheep itself, and the mentality of a Ra'i. And as you know, Ibrahim was Ra'i. Okay, Moses was a Ra'i. Jesus was a Ra'i and Muhammad was a Ra'i. And our society is a God-centered society. It revolves around God. And the shepherd doesn't condescend to think about asking his sheep when he wants to eat them.
Okay. Thank you very much for all the questions and comments. I'm not sure I can answer all of them, unless you give me 2 days. And first of all, to the question raised by the lady. If you invite me to a lecture on Israel and the Middle East, I'll be very happy to give a lecture on this. But this is not the topic of this subject. I mentioned, and I'm going to mention in a moment, some parallels here. The issue is now what is happening to what was on the other side of the hill, apparently for 50 years, a very stable system. Sometimes the stability of a prison under authoritarian regime, but it appeared to be very stable. And this is the reason why the West was very happy with it. Not that the West liked the regimes of Mubarak or the West likes the regime in Saudi Arabia at the moment, but politicians think about stability and not about ideological construct. So, with all due respect, let me just make one comment. Since you mentioned the Baas. The Baas party had elements which were on one hand socialist, on the other hand a little bit fascist. And those two elements lived together. And Saddam Hussein was perhaps the worst example of what happens when you have a Bolshevik system grafted on something which is a fascist or fascist state structure. But there's an interesting thing on the Baas party which was, I think, overlooked by many observers. The Baas party for 30 years ruled both Syria and Iraq. But there was a split between the Syrian wing and the Iraqi wing. And when you look at the way in which the split was described in the West, I mean, a split which really meant that the border between Iraq and Syria was closed for more than a decade, it was viewed more in terms of geopolitics, in terms of the differences between Saddam and others. The split in the Baas party was between the Alawite-dominated Syrian Baas party and the Sunni-dominated Iraqi party. As simple as that. I see that you happen to disagree. The fact of the matter is that those were two regimes, both of them dictatorial, both of them aiming more or less at the same Arab nationalist unity, but the fact that they were led by two very different groups and communities made it very difficult for them to work together. I'm very grateful to Dr. Abu Jaber for your comments, and I agree with most of them. Since you brought in the shepherd, and I think it's a very powerful image. I think that one of the problems is that our shepherds today drive in limousines and fly airplanes. If I may put it in another way, that we deal here, I'm being serious, that we deal here with the crisis of modernization. Modernization grafted on very traditional societies, if you wish, tradition of shepherds, and some of the paradoxes which I try to suggest to you have to do with the clash between traditional conservative structures and beliefs and the pressures of modernity. Let me also mention that I referred to the paradox that Arab nationalism as a modern ideology was basically prompted not only during World War I, but later also by Michel Aflaq, by people who come from a Christian background. There is a paradox here. There is a similar paradox in Zionism. The Zionism as a political movement came from secular people. Religious Jews believe that you have to wait for the Messiah and viewed Herzl as a false Messiah and an apostate. But in both cases, I think, in the case of Arab nationalism and in the case of Zionism and Jewish nationalism, there was an historical background which had religious connotations. And therefore, today, some of those religious connotations come to the surface, and they are the most radical on both sides. I think that even Christian Arabs, who are Arab nationalists in a way, view Muhammad as having a meaning to them, despite the fact that they are Christian, and he was, of course, the founder of Islam. So I'm very grateful that you raise this issue, and I think you brought out the complexities of modernity. I should also add one element. I didn't mention it because I didn't want to go too much into historical. I went too much into historical dilemmas anyway. But the fact of the matter is that when you look at the first peace treaty, which was signed after World War I in the Middle East, Peace Treaty of Sevres, not only was it committed to an independent Armenian state, an independent Kurdish state, and this was then changed because of Atatürk and the development, but one of the signatories of Sevres was the Armenian Republic. The foreign minister of the Armenian Republic, which was still struggling to exist, was one of the things, and then things have changed. So one of the problems of the post-Ottoman space was that when you look at Versailles, with all its problems, the Versailles Treaty and the other treaties which were connected with this, Trianon and Saint-Germain, had a clause about minority rights. Those minority rights were not always implemented, but there was a mechanism in the League of Nations in which the new countries, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Yugoslavia, had to report annually to the League of Nations how they treat their minorities. It didn't work because the League of Nations didn't work, we know that. But there was at least a normative element there. Such a normative element about minority or small communities protection did not exist, not only in Sykes-Picot, but also not in Sanremo and later in Lausanne, which made the idea of majoritarianism the only legitimate norm that was then applied very dramatically to minorities. And in the case of Iraq, when you had the Assyrian rebellion in the 1920s, the Iraqi army was supported by the British, who were bombing the Assyrians. So the fact that the West has been involved here, and sometimes in a very problematic way, is something, not that the West is responsible. The problems have to do with the complexity, as you very well mentioned, and the complexities are here, and they're not going to be easier, and they cannot be done away. And I'm going to say to our European friends that one of the paradoxes, actually, not that I like paradoxes, but I want to look at paradoxes. One of the paradoxes of the European Union is that on one hand, you have a vision of a European Union, that people view themselves as Europeans and not in French or German and British of them. But on the other hand, it is the European Union that gave impetus to separatist movement, be it in Scotland, be it in Catalonia, and in other places as well. So the idea that we are in a transnational or post-national state in Europe, shwoye. I mean, this is not the case. This is not the case in Europe, and therefore Europeans should be at least tolerant when they criticize, and sometimes justly so, developments in the Middle East, because not that charity begins at home, but the home picture is more complicated than the ideology of European unity. And I'm saying it not in a critical way, but trying to understand what is happening. Zur letzten Frage der Dame. Vielleicht einer der Probleme der Staaten im Nahen Osten, und Dr. Abu Jabbar sagte es, dass große Imperien waren immer sehr weit von der Bevölkerung, dass die Bevölkerung nicht immer Kontakte hatte mit einer Bürokratie, sondern es wurde mediatisiert durch Gruppen und Millet und so weiter. Und eine der Probleme, die jetzt klarer sind, als sie vorher waren, ist, dass in einer solchen Situation, wo ein Staat vielleicht schwächer ist, als man es will, dass Zivilgesellschaft eine große Macht hat. Aber, und da ist wieder das Problem, wir wissen, dass in Mittel- und Osteuropa die Frage eine Möglichkeit zur Transformation, zur Demokratie und zur Toleranz hat zu tun mit der Stärke der Zivilgesellschaft. Wenn die Zivilgesellschaft in Ländern wie Polen und Tschechien und Slowakien und sogar Ungarn mit dem jetzigen Problem, wo eine Tradition der Zivilgesellschaft existiert, ist eine Transformation möglich und leichter. Wo die Zivilgesellschaft historischerweise schwach war, wie in Russland oder in der Ukraine, sehen wir jetzt die Schwierigkeiten. Im Nahen Osten sehen wir etwas Ähnliches, aber nicht Identisches. Dass wenn man sich Ägypten anschaut, und Ägypten ist ein solides Land sozusagen, verglichen mit Irak und mit Syrien, wenn das stärkste Element der Zivilgesellschaft die Muslim Brotherhood ist, haben wir da ein Problem. Weil dann ist die Zivilgesellschaft nicht der Motor für Toleranz und Pluralismus, sondern gar der Zivilgesellschaft. Und die demokratische Legitimität, die durch Wahlen dann erworben wird, geht in eine andere Richtung. In anderen Worten, auch hier muss man differenzieren zwischen was sich im Westen abgespielt hat und wieder, man darf den Westen nicht idealisieren, so wie Sie gesagt haben, 300 Jahre von Kriege und so weiter haben doch, Europa war nicht das Land des Friedens seit der Reformation und sicher auch nicht vorher. Da muss man differenzieren zwischen dieser Struktur der Staaten und der Zivilgesellschaft und die differenzierte Konsequenzen von diesen Unterschieden. Dass man da die Staatenmacht im Nahen Osten oder im Levant hat ganz andere Funktionen gehabt, historisch, unter dem Osmanischen Reich und auch unter den sogenannten, aber falschen westfälischen Ländern, die nach 1917 oder 1918 im Nahen Osten entstanden sind.
Thank you. Are there some other comments or?
Mikro, bitte.
Mikro, ja.
Ich möchte nochmal nachfragen nach den Auswirkungen der Bevölkerungsexplosion, die zu erwarten ist, diesem Ungleichgewicht zwischen einer ganz, ganz starken jungen Bevölkerung südlich des Mittelmeers, einer veralteten Bevölkerung nördlich des Mittelmeers und auch der Globalisierung. Das ist ja diese neue Herausbildung eines irgendwie gearteten politischen Systems in den arabischen Staaten, ist ja im Kontext der Globalisierung zu sehen. Wie werden da die Auswirkungen sein?
Ich bin nicht sicher, dass ich eine gute Antwort habe, weil die Situation doch in stato nascendi ist. Schauen Sie, hätten wir diese Konferenz vor einem Jahr gehalten, wäre die Diskussion ganz anders. Wäre noch die Hoffnung, dass der Arabische Frühling irgendwie langsam eine neue Staatenbildung schafft. Heute ist es anders. Ich kann Ihnen leider keine gute Antwort geben. Ich weiß nicht. Das soll man niemand sagen, aber ich weiß nicht.
Yeah. Prof. AVINERI, I'm a former diplomat, Prof from Mountstown. You have insisted very much on the connection between. Sorry, you have insisted very much on the connection between secular regimes and authoritarian regimes. Do you see any future for secular or more or less secular regimes in the Middle East in the near future or at present?
Okay. Should I say I hope? But should I say I'm not sure? Let me go back to many of the hopes. So, let me go back to the hopes that the Arab Spring has brought about all over the world. When it first happened in Tunisia and in Egypt, with very little violence, which was very impressive, people were thinking in terms of 1848, Welcher Frühling, I mean, that's why the term Arab Spring, 1989, Central Eastern Europe. And there was something which had to do with what I would like to call the CNN effect or the Al Jazeera effect. We saw it in real time. We were all at Tahrir Square. This was so dramatic, much more dramatic than in 1989. In 1989, we saw it a day later. Here we saw it in real time, modern technology. And we saw in Tahrir Square multitudes of young people who look modern, wearing T-shirts and jeans, and having mobile smartphones, and having Facebook and Twitter accounts, and we thought this is Egypt. Well, this is part of Egypt. Egypt is 85 million people, most of whom, for whom the ideas of secularization is not yet an agenda. They do not only do they not have, most of them, smartphones, but many of them do not have electricity and clean drinking water. And therefore, when they were given a choice politically, they either expressed it in terms of conventional religiosity, or later on, after the coup, in terms of support for the army, because the army is giving you stability. Before the elections to the first election to parliament in Egypt, Egyptian secular sociologists, let me name just Saadettin Ibrahim, who is the best Egyptian sociologist, Western educated, open-minded, did serious research. He said publicly that perhaps the Muslim parties will get 25% maximum. It turned out to be 75%. And it has to do also perhaps with the fact that this is a CNF effect, that we relate so much to people who are verbally active because we listen to them. The majorities are not always very verbally active. They don't sit in front of TV. They may be recipients of TV, but they don't talk to the TV. And therefore you had a situation where 75% who voted for Islamic parties, a year later, after the military coup, not the exact 75%, but the majority of them voted for the kind of stability and the terrible choices that have confronted the secular, urban, upper middle class minority, which was the one who was at Tahrir Square. That when they had to make a choice between the Muslim Brotherhood and the military dictatorship, which initially was very bloody, now it's trying to be a little bit more careful, a little bit. I mean, it in the first weeks, it killed hundreds and hundreds of people. Now there is no shooting in Egypt. It is a little less violent. When they had to make a choice between a majoritarian, legitimate, democratic elected government, which was Islamic, and a military dictatorship of sorts, they choose a military dictatorship. I don't envy them the kind of choice, but this was the only choice they had given their realities. And therefore, secularism, yes. But I think in Egypt at the moment, secularism in one way or another is guaranteed, but it's guaranteed by the bayonets of the army military dictatorship. So we are back in a way to the old secular imposed. However, and this may be a difference, that there is no doubt that the military dictatorship at the moment has a lot of popular support. Whether this popular support will continue when the economic issues will become then at the center, I do not know. But it is today not appearing as just a secularism imposed from above. It has a lot of support. But the kind of secularism, which again, the other one has to remind ourselves that the separation of church and state in France happened only at the beginning of the 20th century, 120 years after the French Revolution. So we should have patience.
Professor Jaber? Okay. Yeah, bitte.
Yes, I just you mentioned the neo-millet system as something like perhaps not an utopia, but a possible model. Now, before coming back to this, I wanted just to take up the question about secularism. If there is one force, and I say it a bit provocatively, in the Middle East now, then the Kurds are the secular force. These are new actors. And these are the burned children of the 20th century. They do not believe in Mises. They do not believe in neo-Ottomanism. They do not believe in caliphate. They do not believe in neo-Islam and all kinds of these, let's say, renaissances of. Yes, this is, of course, there are Kurds, there are many splits. There are also Islamist parties, a new Islamist party now in Turkey. And there are, of course, also AKP voters among the Kurds. But if we take them as a whole, then we see this is probably the most secular force, even more secular, perhaps, than Israel today on the political surface. So now with neo-millet, if we look at the millets, and the millet system was institutionalized only in the mid-19th century. And then this was, for me, if I read the papers, and especially the Reform Edict the Reform Edict of 1856, for me this is utopia. This is unbelievable. There was still slavery in the United States. In Switzerland, the Jews could not move freely. And there was a model of total pluralism, democratic millet systems that had, according to the will of the Sultan, to give themselves parliaments. And there was equality. And this is the most important and the most difficult point, as you said, I have forgotten your name, our Jordanian colleague. The equality is the most difficult point. Why? Because I would say there are the secret scripts of salutary history, of the history of Heilsgeschichte, what we call Heilsgeschichte in German. And all those who have religion in the at any place, I do not know, in the heart or in the mind, they follow when it is critical, when there is pressure. So this is a question of the primordial solidarity, these scripts of religion. So there is a problem with the neo-millet, because there is again the problem, and what is the warrant, the guarantee of equality in that case? So again, you would need a structure that gives, that really implements equality for a complicated structure of different millets, that these religious communities, because these are strictly religious communities. The Kurds were never a millet, so let's be absolutely clear about this. So I do not see in any way a perspective of neo-millet if there is not the strong new structure of equality. I would say in the case of the Kurds, I could see such a future, because already the Kurdish territories are the territories where really ethno-religious plurality, even if very precariously, can survive. And refugees, of course, go there because they know that's so. So the question is this, did I understand you correctly? Or what is your vision of neo-millet system? Thank you.
There's another comment here, please. This will be the last. Are there some other who want to say something? Yeah, that's the point. Okay.
Also from a perspective of Turkey, and I'm working more with the social movement. I'm not so much a scientist and more active on the ground of the social movements. If you're looking at the social movements in Turkey today, I think a millet system is not at all attractive to the majority of the social movements inside of Turkey. And I would agree with what you said, that the Kurdish movement inside of Turkey, and also maybe also in the neighboring countries, is the most, at least for Turkey, it's the movement that is the most progressive movement in Turkey concerning also democratic standards. If you have a look from a gender democratic perspective, because any millet system, any kind of authoritarian systems we had in the last 100 years in the region are at least not gender democratic, and I think it's also one of the problems in these societies, and I think we should not neglect that fact, because what is very impressive is, for example, in the Kurdish movement inside of Turkey, the fact that they introduced a kind of quota system which is used on the village level in a very conservative region, has an incredible mobilizing factor for the social society on the ground, and encourages a social change which we really missed for many, many years also in the Kurdish regions, at least in Turkey, which I know better. So I think when we are talking about future, I think millet system is really not a good option. And second, we should think also about gender democratic standards.
Thank you. There's the last one, please.
Thank you. Yes, I can relate positively to the last two speakers and Ms. Dufner. And my question is to that picture, which is repeated the last years in a lot of European debates related to Islamization, going on with new wars and conflicts. And I think that we are not living in a separated world. Europe in itself with its own developments related to democracy, and then the Middle East as a separate space within world politics and geopolitics, and as the lady said, economic and media globalization, which has then its own time for developments. I think the situation is more complicated, and there has never been a linear, in European history too, there has not been a linear development of democracy, especially in Germans know with the rollback of Nazi time, that in a way you cannot speak about a linear democratic development within 300, 500 years. I think that patience is necessary with all conflicts, and that I agree, but I think we need different political terms to understand the, yes, how within a globalized media society we have rollbacks organized, and we are not in a time where you have different types of movements back and forward at the same time, and we need new political terms for it, I think. And I think there has been organized rollback by Khomeini, there had been organized rollback by Ahmadinejad, there has been organized rollback since 50 or 70 years from the Muslim Brotherhood, and there are other movements which are trying to go in another slowly or more quickly direction, like the Kurds, like women's movements, like some social movements in the area.
Well, thank you. Let me say, like President Nixon once said, let me be perfectly clear. I'm not advocating neo-millet. I'm just saying that one has to think perhaps outside the box of the Westphalian nation state as we know it in the West. And I have an example of a neo-millet system. It's not working very well. It's in Belgium. When you look very carefully at the Belgian system, it's not called, God forbid, the Belgians will never call it neo-millet or anything like this. But it has elements of not only of territoriality, but also of cultural affiliation. And I don't have a nostalgia towards the old Austro-Hungarian Empire, but it was the Austro-Marxists who tried before 1914 to develop a system of reforming the Austro-Hungarian Habsburg Empire on a level, on two levels. That on one hand, it should be democratized, there should be territorial basis for parliament, but there should also be parliaments or diets, Tag, on cultural level. That all Czech speakers and all Hungarian speakers and all Polish speakers, they had problems with Yiddish speakers, but it's a different story, should have also competences regarding culture, history, education, etc. Now, this is something which the Jacobin state is against, of course. The Jacobin Republic, one and indivisible, is against something as pluralistic as that. But I'm suggesting one should look at it. Again, I'm aware of the I'm glad that the Turkish history was brought in much more in detail than I did. I'm aware of how the millet system, as it developed as part of the Tanzimat, in a way, was part of the attempt of Turkey at modernization, because Turkey has tried to modernize now for almost 150 years. This is not something that happened in the last few years or last few decades. And it just shows the complexity of it. And it shows the complexities. Of course, there is no Turkish millet and there is no Kurdish millet, because we're talking about different developments. But, and I'm taking a little bit of a encouragement for what's happening in the KRG. Again, I'm not idealizing the KRG, the Kurdish regional government. It's a coalition of two Kurdish factions, we know all of that. But when you look at the assembly of the KRG, there are guaranteed representation for minorities, for Christian minorities, for the Turkoman minorities. It doesn't solve all the problems. But the idea that when one looks at democratic representation, one should not only look at numbers and at percentages, but one should also take into account the ability of respect to different ethno-religious groups. It is easier, and I want to be very blunt about it, when those groups are 2 or 5%. It's much more difficult when those groups are 25 or 30%. One has to be realistic about it. But to think again that the mechanism of democracy should not in all cases be just direct representation of majorities, minorities, opposition parties, government parties, but one should respect different cultural, religious, and ethnic or ethno-religious background. This is something that one has to look at. It goes against the grain of the Jacobin undivided republic, but I think it is something that one should look carefully. I was just mentioning neo-millet because this is a term which was used by Habib Malek. I'm not sure this is the right term. It may create image that we're going back to a conservative, pre-modern system. This is not the case. It has to be based on understanding, and I'm saying it as somebody who is, I think, somehow related to the Enlightenment, that the Enlightenment idea that religion will disappear when the sun of rationalism rises upon humanity is a little simplistic. Religion is not about belief. Religion is not just about God. Religion is not just about holy books. Religion is about identity. And once you fight in an anti-clerical way against religious institutions, you're not fighting against God or the terrible church that Voltaire was fighting against. You're fighting against people identity. And if you do not respect people identity, even if you don't agree with it, you create problems and you have then the return of the repressed. So we have to have, if you wish, an Enlightenment 2 system where you realize that religion is not just about religious beliefs, it's about identities. And I'm not saying that identity politics should be dominant, no. But identity politics should be integrated as much as possible into when we think about democratic transitions. Because if you do not do it, you get a simplistic majoritarian view. I remember a talk at a back channel meeting we had, some Israelis with some members of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood when Morsi was a president. And one of the members said, well, we are a majority, we have majority, we won 3 elections, and we have majority rights. And democracy is not just about majority rights, it is also about human rights, it is about minority rights, and about respecting identities of people who do not belong to the majority. It's not easy, but I think the Middle East suggests to us that one has to look very carefully at this. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.
Short notes concerning the reception. The reception is warm here, and we have about 10 minutes more. Just ask for a little patience, but it is in the foyer, so everybody will find it. Thank you.
Oh, okay. But okay.
Okay.
Das war das Schlusswort.
Ah, danke.
Oh, gut. Schön.
Probleme kommen. So,